Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hey guys, Brian Parker here. I want to welcome you guys back to another edition of our All Me podcast. I'm excited for this episode because today we get to spend some time talking with a friend of the foundation, Bob Copeland. Bob was faced with an incredibly difficult decision in his career when he dealt with one of the largest doping scandals in Canadian university sport. Before his current position, Bob was the athletic director at the University of Waterloo up in Ontario. While he was there, he found widespread use of anabolic steroids and other performance-enhancing substances going on within his football program. After a long investigation, Bob and his team decided to suspend that program for a full year. So in this episode, Bob is going to tell us the story of what he found, the investigation of what happened, the process behind that decision, a lot of the backlash that he received, but ultimately, we're going to discuss the positive outcomes that came as a result. When all of this happened, we met Bob when we brought our education program up to his students at Waterloo, and ultimately, he was the driving force behind us getting our message into a lot of other universities across Canada at that time. We're also going to talk with Bob a little bit about his position at McLaren Global Sports Solution, working with Richard McLaren. Many of you may be familiar with Richard. He's one of the bigger names in the anti-doping space, as he was an integral part of the Mitchell Report in Major League Baseball, and also part of the McLaren Report on the state-sponsored Olympic rushing doping scandal. They have worked together on a variety of issues that center on the integrity in sport. Bob has always fought for what is right as sport and is a great partner to the Taylor Hooten Foundation. I'm excited to welcome Bob to the show. So let's bring him in and hear Bob's story. Bob, great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for spending some time with me today.
Happy to be here.
So, Bob, I just gave the listeners a pretty good introduction to you and some of the issues we're going to talk about and some of the stories that have connected us in our past. And we're going to get to all of that and spend most of our time talking about that. But I think it's fair for our listeners, and I always like to start these things getting to know the guest just a little bit more. So here's what I'm going to start with. I want to start with you and your upbringing, your background. So tell us a little bit about where you grew up and where you went to school. Were you involved with athletes as athletics as a young person? Essentially, like, what was your path leading up to where you are now? And maybe try your best to sum up your life story in a few minutes for us.
Sure. Well, for your American listeners, I'm from Canada and I currently live in Canada and grew up in Canada, the Great White North. But we're pretty close to the United States. I'm a 1 hour drive from Buffalo and maybe 2 hours from Detroit. So we always kind of grew up as a little bit of an extension of the United States in terms of our media consumption and sports consumption and all of that. But I grew up in the suburbs of Toronto, Ontario, in a community called Brampton, which is a very large community, maybe 500,000 people, went to high school there. I was born actually out in Regina, Saskatchewan in Western Canada. My father was a professional football player in the Canadian Football League. So I was brought up around sport, specifically brought up around football, played football, varsity football in high school and other sports, soccer and basketball and things like that. And then went to university about an hour away from my home, a university called the University of Waterloo that we're going to be talking about a little bit more today. I got my bachelor's and master's degree at Waterloo and really wanted to work in sport. I didn't really have a clue what I wanted to do, but that kind of set me on my journey. And I know we'll talk about career path later, but I'm a Canadian boy, but very, very fond of the United States. Have many great friends and colleagues through my job in the United States.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Whenever I hear someone say, they go to university, they weren't sure what they wanted to do. Man, that is me. I feel like that's so many of our young people. It's so hard to ask a 18-year-old to know what you want to do with your life. But I was the same way. Went to school, wasn't sure, studied sports management, went into that world for a little bit as well. And I still kind of get my fix of that with what I do now. But I totally get exactly where your mindset was. And what's cool about your story, you mentioned you went to university at Waterloo. That really leads us into kind of one of the biggest stories we're going to talk about this afternoon, and that's what happened when you were an AD there. So that's really, after you went to school there, you ended up becoming the athletic director at Waterloo as well, and you did that for, I believe, around 17 years. And as I mentioned in the intro, you really faced, I mean, let's be honest, one of the biggest doping scandals in kind of Canadian university athletics that has happened up to this day. And so before we get into really what you did about the scandal and what you did about the issues, tell our listeners the details of the story itself of the scandal, what you discovered that was going on there specifically within your football program.
Sure. Just one point of correction. I was the AD there for 6 years. I was at the university for 18. I worked in other capacities in senior administration with the university, but I always had this, desire to be an athletic director, and I got that job, and everyone referred to it as my dream job, which I thought it was at the time. So when this incident happened, that I'm going to walk you through right now, I was the AD there for around a year, and still kind of working my way through a lot of the systems and processes. And then one day I got a call. I remember it like it was yesterday, but it was 10 years ago. I got a call. It was on a Friday afternoon. It was from our university police services, who work closely with the regional police in Waterloo, and they had arrested 2 people. The person was arrested for a break and enter. They went back to his place of residence off campus, and they found a huge cache of steroids. Well, I'm talking 40,000 pills, vials, paraphernalia. And I remember getting that call and getting that gut feeling like, oh my gosh, this is pretty substantial. This is a current player on the football team living with other players and alumni from the football team. So, obviously where there's smoke, there's fire. So that was a Friday afternoon. And according to our rules, and these are a little bit different in Canada than the United States, but university football in Canada is governed by the Canadian Anti-Doping Program, which is a signatory to the World Anti-Doping Agency. So these players are subjected to tests, or can be subjected to tests, or be requested to take a test, but you have to have a rationale for doing that. So obviously I had a rationale to suggest we need to test these athletes that are involved in this break and enter and having possession of steroids. So I immediately contacted the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, who manage the testing program for university sport. They would be the equivalent of the US Anti-Doping Agency. And on the Friday afternoon, we had a conversation, and they suggested that I should try to identify maybe 12 to 15 players, and they'd like to come out and test those players, including the 2 players in question. I was quite uncomfortable with this. I didn't really know anything about steroids. I maybe had some stereotypical observations about it, and I just wasn't comfortable in terms of the criteria or how to evaluate who to test. So I threw back to them. I said, why don't we test the whole team? And there's some silence on the other end of the line. Yeah. And they agreed. They were highly supportive of that, as was our administration. I had to go to them initially before suggesting that, because it was a costly endeavor and they had to support some of that. So we made the decision within one day to test the entire team. And then the test was to be conducted the following Wednesday. So within 5 or 6 days, we had the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, a staff of probably a dozen people, fly to Waterloo from Ottawa. We had many other chaperones who have to observe drug tests, recruited nurses and people like that. And we called a team meeting on the Wednesday morning at 7 a.m. The players didn't know this was an unannounced test. They didn't know that the entire team was going to be tested, nor would they have ever imagined that was going to happen. But we had called a team meeting. They knew that the players had been arrested, so I think they thought they were going to get a talking to. And by the way, when you play football in Canada, you sign an acknowledgement that you agree to be tested at any time. So we had gathered, I would say, probably close to 40 people, administrators, testers, kind of sequestered them at about 6 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday in our athletic complex, so as not to tip off any of the athletes when they arrived for the meeting at 7. And then we proceeded to, once they arrived, we had them all in the locker room. We had all these people walk in, and we said that the entire team was going to be tested. So that's kind of the first part of the story. I'll take a breath and let you continue with any other questions you have around those decisions.
Yeah, no, you've set the scene beautifully. I can imagine in that same situation, you're faced with that arrest and almost some shock, right? That's got to be the initial. Anytime something hits you, you're like, oh wow, like I wasn't expecting that. I'm not quite sure what to do next. But I agree. I'm glad that you did decide to make this an entire team issue and test the whole team. And I guess that's my next part of the story. And my next question is, what was the results? So you faced the whole team, like you already know that probably a couple guys that are there living there were involved, but how deep did it run?
Well, I'll walk through a little bit of the test and I'll get to the results, but you're exactly right. Like I wasn't really sure what to do. And the other thing is the University of Waterloo, people call the MIT of Canada. And by the way, MIT has a football team. Our football team had not been very successful. If someone was going to be accused of taking steroids, I would have thought that maybe it would have been a better performing team. Supposedly, the people that get into the university are very smart, smart to take these things, but it didn't even cross my mind that somebody on our football team or many people would be involved in this. So another reason we decided to test the whole team is if we did not do it, we had a guy on the team, his name was Joel Reinders. He was 6'8", is 6'8", about 360 pounds at the time. He came to Waterloo as a basketball player and had put on 40 or 50 pounds over the previous year. They recruited him to play football. He had never played football in his life. And I knew that that's one of the first people would point their finger at, suggesting that this guy must be on it. He gained weight fast. He's 6'8". Or the guy over there in the corner with all the tattoos, all the stereotypical type of things, right?
Right.
So when I talk about the decision, I talk about Joel because I remember when we came into the dressing room, having a conversation with Joel, and he was pretty cool and calm. And I said, "Are you okay?" He goes, "Yeah, why wouldn't I be?" Like he was a good, religious student athlete. And you know what? He came clean. And, had we not tested the entire team and Joel, he'd have that scarlet letter on his jersey probably for the rest of his life. And what's really interesting with the story is after that kind of suspended season, he went to rookie camp with, I want to say Cleveland. And he went right down to final cuts, ended up coming back, played in the Canadian Football League with the Toronto Argonauts, won a Grey Cup. And so, that's the story I tell in terms of why we made the decision to test the whole team. But, back to your question about the results. So there were a total of 9 adverse results. And I say results and not tests because when we announced the testing, we had a couple of athletes, and this was extremely difficult. I remember being in a small coach's office with me, an athlete, our head coach, and, and an athlete like breaking down in tears, a big, strong football player, right? And admitting that said, the jig is up. I've been taking the stuff and you don't need to test me. So in our rules, that's a disclosure and it's an automatic suspension. So the athlete didn't need to be tested. So we had a couple of self-disclosures that are included in the 9. And then the rest were for various substances, including one who tested for human growth hormone. This was the first, I think, positive test for this, at least at a university in North America. And when we tested, we tested all of the athletes with urine and then another half of them through blood tests. And that's how we caught the HGH So 9, it represented about 15% of the team. But what's interesting about this that adds to the story is it's not like you get these tests the same day or the next week. This was a huge testing mission. I mean, the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, the closest thing they had done to that was I think a Pan American Games or previous Olympics in Canada. Like, this was a big mission is what they called it. So it took almost upwards of 3 months to get the tests. So over that 3-month period, it was it was like McCarthyism in the United States back in the day, where people were just pointing fingers and accusing people of being on steroids and showing up to athletic banquets with names checked. And so it was a very, very difficult time to work through that process. And at that point, no decisions had been made in terms of the team, the program, any of the athletes. We were just basically in a waiting game for 3 months.
Well, there's 2 things that you just said that are really stuck with me that I want to ask you about and make a comment on. The first one are the preconceptions that people have when it comes to things like anabolic steroids and HGH, right? Because I've been in my role for a decade now. And I'm going to be honest with you, Bob, most people that I call will tell me we don't have that problem here. That's, like, you need to call the big Division I schools with the pro athletes and all that stuff. They think this is a small town. We're an academic school. Like, there's no way. And so I think that your story adds to that. And like, what we're talking about is universal. It's being used everywhere. And I think a lot of that relates just back to pressures that exist with being a human being, right? We all want to get better at something. We all have goals. We all want to improve. It doesn't have to be, oh, I'm trying to be a pro athlete. It can be something as small as just making the team. It's just, that sticks with me when you say that, because I've just been faced with the other side of that coin many times in my career, just being told, well, no, like, we're good. That's not a problem here. And we'll get into kind of the next steps beyond that a little bit later. So my question then, in regards to what you just said, is, okay, so that you've got 9 issues here, and I didn't know that it took, a few months to get that back. So I'm curious, like, what options are going through your head for 3 months? Because we'll talk about the decision you ended up making here in just a second. But what were you considering? Like, were you considering shutting it all down? Were you considering just punishing the 9? Like, what was going through your head for those few months?
Well, as you can imagine, there were a lot of people brought into this with the university, because it was a pretty huge issue affecting the reputation of the university. And we met, we had a senior team that met weekly for a couple months, kind of contemplating different options. And to be completely honest with you, suspending the team for a year was not one of the top options or discussed options, because as we talked through this, we didn't actually know that it was 9. It was like just coming in drips. And, we were focused on, education and better understanding this. And the university wanted to launch an independent review. So there were no specific decisions. We game planned a lot of different things in those meetings over the 2 to 3 months. But once the full results were known, the 15, the decision was actually made by the provost of the university. So in university language, kind of the vice president of the university made the decision to suspend the team. I was the recipient of the decision as the athletic director, and I had to deliver the news to our coaching staff. I had to deliver the news to our athletes on the morning of the press conference to announce all of this. And it was just, it was probably the worst professional day of my life, having to tell the team in a locker room that your season's done, and walk over to a press conference, and players weren't happy. But I was on the fence, to be honest with you, as the athletic director. I could see both sides, the value of the benefits of suspending the season and all the disruption and harm and it was going to cause a lot of the clean athletes. So I was very conflicted. Probably the most difficult thing I had to do through that process, other than tell those athletes that their season was over, was I had to suspend our coaching staff during the course of this review. So we announced an independent review on the day of the press conference to announce the results, and I had to suspend our coaches pending the review. I knew without question that these were, men of great integrity, and you hear stories, of complicity of coaches, and it certainly wasn't the case. And these are great leaders of young men, and that was a tough day.
Yeah, I can only imagine. You've told me the story, but I wasn't in those shoes. So, there's so much that goes into something like that. It has to be difficult. There's just no way for that not to be difficult. I mean, I could be conflicted myself. I think I would ultimately err on the decision that you guys made. And that, as you can hear Bob alluding, like they did shut down the program for a year. And maybe that just comes from what I've been doing for so long. I always tend to want to err to, okay, let's make a little bit more of an example here. Let's have a little bit more on the line here. Let's have a little bit more deterrent for this kind of stuff moving forward. But that doesn't mean that doesn't also come with backlash and also punish players that were doing it right. So that's kind of leads us into the next question. Like I already know that you had to get backlash for that decision. What kind of stuff did you hear, and what was your response when you heard that kind of stuff?
It was incredible, the amount of backlash. I still have to this day every email that I received, both pro and con in terms of that decision, and it numbers in the 4,000 range. Wow. I would get, and some of them are just, some of them were just extremely well written and well argued. Like I remember getting one from a colonel in the Canadian military saying it wasn't fair. To impassioned notes of support from parents or people who've been through something similar. Tremendous support from my colleagues in university athletics, from my university. But it was tough. I remember getting phone calls at home saying that I was going to be fired, that the university knew about this, like all kinds of conspiracy theories. So there was a lot of, the good thing about it is there was a lot of debate and discussion that drew a lot of attention to the issue. But, what I remember most is the players. The players, they went on a media caravan, like rented a limousine, went to all the media outlets in Toronto, trying to get the decision overturned. They held rallies in the packed gymnasium at the university. All wearing these T-shirts, and family and friends and speakers. And we even had, I remember it was during graduation convocation at the university. We had one professor, actually a friend of mine, who was up on the speaking at the table with all his convocation robes on. And it was quite dramatic. But the university held firm, and they did not reverse the decision. I think it was correct that they did that. This is an issue that was bigger than football. And, part of the argument was you're punishing the innocent people. But, in hindsight, looking at this and looking actually at the results of the review and interviewing a lot of the players on the team, there's still this culture of, kind of knew it was going on, but it's not my problem. But, being on a team, it is your problem. It's, people don't want to rat on their teammates, but there certainly was knowledge that this was happening. So, it's really everybody's responsibility. And so the university stood firm, and we decided to try to approach this from maybe a more proactive, education-focused way, and then trying to impress upon people it was, a little bigger than sport, although very, very difficult.
Right. Yeah, education, that's a key word you just said, and that's going to kind of transition us. A couple of other things you just said is, I agree. I just can't imagine that many students, positive tests and the issues that came back, that it just wasn't fairly common knowledge amongst the team. That's very hard to be around that group of people daily and not have some idea on what might be going on. So sure, not everybody was doing it, but it's, group thought was probably there, which I don't say that justifies it, everything that happened. There is no answer here that's perfect for every situation, but I would lean more towards agreeing that's just, that sets a precedent there. And what you have to do with that is not think too much on that backlash. You have to focus on the positives that come out of that and the change that comes out of that. And I think I applaud you the most out of all of this wasn't even just the decision that was made as difficult as it was. I think it's actually what happened next, because you talk about education. Here's the truth. You could have shut that down and it could have just been over. You could have put your head in the sand. Let's let this all blow over. The news will forget about it next year and go from there. But you guys didn't. I mean, you specifically wanted to take it a step further and provide education on this topic. And that's essentially where we met paths. I mean, so you could tell us a little bit about the story of how we got connected. It's not too complex of a story. I think you just found us, but why was that education such an important step in this process?
Actually, I didn't find you. You found me. I remember getting.
We're good at that, right?
Yeah, you are. I remember getting a letter. Remember those things? You get actually a letter in the mail.
I barely remember.
I got a letter from Donald Hooten, introducing the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and essentially saying, is there anything we can do to help you? So this also gives you a sense of the scope of this issue. Like, this was far beyond Canada. This was a North American issue. It was in the New York Times, Deadspin, Al Jazeera, you name it. So I remember getting this letter, thinking I'm all alone on this little island in Canada, figuratively speaking. And the first thing I did was I responded immediately saying, I need all the help I can get. If you're willing to get on a plane and come up to Canada, I'd be more than happy to have you here. And Donald came to Canada. He was in the press conference, sitting in the press conference. So on the day of our press announcement, and then I remember we had lunch after, and it was just an incredible supportive presence. I didn't know anything about the foundation or Taylor's story. I got to know Donald through that, and then I really became an advocate in this area and got the Taylor Hooten Foundation involved a little more extensively in Canada with other universities, brought him back to Waterloo, as well as others from the foundation to do some education and kind of introduce what you guys do in Canada. Yeah,
I mean, that's one of the things I can remember back when all of this happened. One of the things that we wanted you to know when we reach out, and we want anyone to know when we reach out, is like, look, this isn't a Waterloo issue. It probably feels like that in the moment, right? It feels like, oh my gosh, I'm dealing with something no one else is. But we just know that. I mean, I could tell you North America alone, there's a couple million kids involved with this stuff, right? Like, I mean, that's the picture here is like, all right, we're reaching out because this education needs to happen, not just on your campus, just as a whole. And so that was such a breath of fresh air for us to then get that response to say, man, that would be great. Like, I would love to educate on this and expand it even beyond my own situation, which is what we always try to do. And you're right. I mean, that's exactly what happened. Like, not only did we work with you guys, we worked across Canada universities for a while. I mean, I know I personally spent a few weeks basically going from Niagara Falls all the way to Toronto, all the way out to Nova Scotia to a bunch of different schools, spreading this message in that education. And we reached thousands of people because of you and because of that decision, which we've always been really grateful for. I remember those programs really specifically. I remember them vividly. And, I got the sense that it wasn't a topic that was being discussed a ton. I mean, there was some education there, and there was some, systems and organizations there that were touching on this some. But I mean, where do you think that education stood? Like, just from your own experience in Waterloo and outside of it, like, how much do you think this was even being discussed at campuses before everything went down?
Not much. I would say kind of standard cookie cutter, check the box education. And, and it's not just when you talk about appearance and performance enhancing drugs, you see that in some other areas, but it's becoming better now. Like you think of, safe sport and harassment, and that's moving from a check the box to much more robust training in that area. But at the time, we had a wallet card. We handed it out to each of the teams. The associate director would go and have a talk to each of the teams at orientation and go through, various things, and we'd just talk about it, but not impactful in any way. The other thing too is at the time, and it still exists today, although it's in a little bit different, the football players had to take an online education module through the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport. We did a focus group of varsity athletes at Waterloo on this training after it happened. And I also participated in some national task force. And it was a very negative feedback on the type of training that was done, very, very transactional type of training. And so it's not just the amount of education, but I think it's how it's delivered. And that's the one thing that was extremely profound for me. And I've probably sat through a dozen or so of the Taylor Hooton Foundation sessions by, I think one was you, several by Donald and Don. And, whether you're in a room of 20 athletes or 600 athletes, you can hear a pin drop because it's all about storytelling and personal experience. And I think that's what really gets through to the athletes, is that this isn't just some kind of benign concept. Like this can ruin your life. This is just, it's something that I think needs to come across in a different way. And I think that's why Taylor Hooton Foundation has been so effective at this. And even just another program that I remember reviewing is the program with Little League World Series, and just the innovative way of delivering content. It's so important now, right? We're all at home with COVID and everything's being delivered online. And I think that's the great differentiators. You have to break through and kind of get through to young people or others in terms of, why this is an important issue. And it's, again, you can't really just say no. You have to kind of talk about, and we had an athlete, we did a lot of education on our own with this, and we developed a DVD of one of the athletes, and he talks about the impact. This is one of the athletes who tested positive. He talked about the impact on having to tell his younger brother and his parents, and how it affects your name for the rest of your life. It might affect your career and those type of things. So, I think it's a matter of how you deliver it, and getting the message through is really where we need to go.
Yeah. I mean, well, first off, thank you for the kind words. I've always felt that what you're saying, it's just as important as how you're saying it. And I've been doing this for 10 years. And before I even talk to people about stuff, I always let them know that, look, I'm not here to tell you what to do and what not to do. I'm not even here to make decisions for you. I'm here to get you the information you need and get you educated on this. So then hopefully in turn, on your own, you're taking that and you're learning from that and you're making the right choices moving forward, and hopefully inspiring you to do things the right way. That's the angle that we have to take. And the way we've always approached this education. And speaking of education, just going back on what you said, like, I don't want it to feel like any way I'm picking on Canada, that there wasn't a lot of education about this. If I'm being honest, that's across the board. I mean, I just know that the majority of our young people aren't hearing about this enough. And I think what happens is, just from everything that I've seen, is so often in society, education will happen as a reaction to something, right? Instead of prevention to something, and I guess I'm curious, like, why do you think that is? And then, like, what advice would you give other leadership that's in a similar position to you, or just in a role, in an AD role or coaching role right now, when it comes to this? Like, what should we do about this? How do we prevent this kind of stuff moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. And when we talk about education, especially with this issue, I think that it's a function of a number of things. One, you talked about this earlier. It's, hey, I don't think we have a problem. And I could put myself in that camp. So if I don't have a problem, why am I going to devote resources to this? So, I mean, I lived that, right? I mean, I was a young athletic director. It wasn't that we weren't doing anything, but felt that what we're doing was enough. And I think you still get that today. Maybe it's happening over there, but our story certainly suggests that it can happen anywhere if it can happen at our university. So that's one, you don't think it's an issue. Two is, and we see this in our business now, whether we're talking about, performance enhancing drugs or harassment or racism or anything like that. Some people are reluctant to kind of put themselves out there and, kind of peel back the layers of the onion and don't want to create problems. So I think there's some trepidation in this subject area and people are uncomfortable about it. But, when I look at what's, happening, what happened with our experience, what's happening with, what's happened with Me Too and people being more vocal. And we talk about, racism and discrimination and diversity and equity. There's a lot more attention and people are, I think, feel more supported to do more in that area. And I think it's, as an administrator, from strictly an administrative, take out all the emotion and out of it. I think the education is critical to mitigate risks. At least in hindsight, you can say that, you did everything that you could do, and that you mitigated risks by letting people know about the issue and their responsibilities around it.
Yeah, I think people get nervous that if I talk about this, I'm admitting I have a problem. And it's, that's just not how it is. I always tell, school, I talk to people that say that's not a problem here. One of the things I'll say, like, look, I hope that is true, but don't you want to keep it that way? Right? Like, I mean, let's look beyond the now. I think that's not just what we're talking about. That's everything. We live in the here and the now, and we're an instant gratification society, and I'll react to what's in front of me. But yeah, it's taking the camera back a little bit and looking at things a little bit more big picture that we do now, that hopefully we'll continue working towards that, more and more. That's what we do every single day.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Education is empowering. I mean, if you look at it, it's empowering. It can change your life, whether you're talking about PEDs or anything where you kind of turn that spark in a young kid or bring something to the fore that they weren't thinking about. We see it a lot with mental health these days, and there's a link obviously between mental health and abusive appearance and performance enhancing drugs.
It's a tongue twister.
So yeah, it is APEDS. So I just think it's so important, and you need to equip people with good information. I think even when you talk about this issue, like instead of saying, and I've had this experience recently with my 15-year-old son who's just starting to get into weight training, and he wanted to get some supplements. So I've lived through this in my personal and professional life, and you just can't say to a kid, don't take supplements, period, because they're going to go out and get something and maybe get something bad. So I used it as an opportunity. I used it as an opportunity to have a conversation with my son. I said, okay, listen, first of all, why do you want the supplement? Well, I want more protein. Well, you can get a lot of it in your food, and half the stuff you're going to be peeing out and wasting a lot of money, or your dad's going to be wasting a lot of money. And then, you talk about convenience, and he wants to gain a little bit of weight. And so you have the discussion. By the way, my 15-year-old son is the most educated young person in Canada on steroids. So
I have no doubt.
He knows. Yeah. So then I said, listen, I'll talk to you about getting something, but it has to be certified. And so we went out and got a product together, and, to do it safely. And you can do it safely, right? But you just can't say no. Yeah. But understand why and what the reasons are. And, and at the university level, we would bring in, and I think you guys are doing a lot of this now, we bring in sports nutritionists to talk about, how to maintain optimal performance through your diet, and how you might, especially as a young person, maybe in university or college, you don't have a lot of money. These supplements are very, very expensive, where you get a lot of this through your diet. So, I mean, that's how education is empowering, and maybe even save you a couple bucks along the way.
Yeah, it just leads to conversations. That's all. That's all. When I talk to parents, coaches, teachers, I always leave them with homework. And my homework sounds so simple, but it is, look, have these conversations with your own family, with your own teams. Anyone that you come across, whenever you feel that time is right, let's discuss this. Because if we don't, then it gets worse down the road. And I think that's what you're saying. So, and I'm glad you've helped us do that so many times, and you've done it yourself so many times. I mean, look, we might have to hire your son. He may start to know more about this stuff than I do. But
Well, he's looking for his first job. So be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, I know. We'll keep an eye out for the resume here pretty soon. But speaking of jobs, the last few minutes I want to spend with you is kind of exploring what you do now, because you're no longer at Waterloo. You're still kind of touch on these issues here and now. But I mentioned at the very beginning in the intro that you're the senior VP at McLaren Global Sports Solutions, and you guys do a lot of different things. And I'll put the website into your group on the show notes so people can kind of dig through and see what you guys do. Your group does a lot of different resources within the world of pro and amateur sports, right? Like, that's such a broad statement for me to say, but like, you've taken your experiences and you kind of apply that to a variety of different resources and kind of consulting with a lot of different groups within sports. So as best you can, like, can you kind of sum up and explain to us a little bit more about what those resources are and your role within that, what you do at McLaren?
Sure, I will. Just how I got introduced to the company was also through what happened at Waterloo. So I was involved in a task force in this issue, and I was recruiting people to join this task force. And my brother, Michael, who was previously the president of the Canadian Football League, he said, you should call this guy. He's just about an hour up the road from you. His name's Richard McLaren, and he's a leading person in terms of, he's a lawyer and has worked on the Mitchell Report, steroids in Major League Baseball. He said, call him and recruit him. So I did that. I cold called him and I got him to participate in this task force and stayed in touch with him. And they decided a couple of years later, after this happened, he was starting a new company focused on integrity in sport. And I was kicking the tires on a few things, and it was a perfect marriage. And so he started this company up about 6 years ago now. And really our business is integrity in sport. I mean, that's something really big to deconstruct here, but we help clients really kind of protect their brand and navigate difficult organizational issues when they come to bear. You just talked about this with education, is oftentimes people don't bring you in until something hits the fan, so to speak, and something bad happens. And we find that as well, but we have some very proactive clients that are working with us, and we help them to kind of navigate these issues and anything around integrity, whether it's, investigations of things related to whether it's harassment or PEDs, corruption. Richard McLaren is very well known in that area and has a lifetime of experience. He was the independent person who proved state-sponsored doping with Russia in the Sochi Olympics.
Yeah.
And then you combine that with other people who are involved with our company and my personal experience. It was a natural fit.
Yeah, you answered one of my questions. I kind of assumed that your story and your past, some of the work you had done, was the reason you guys got connected. But look at you, man! You're handing out job tips. You cold call them, you stay in touch, and now look at where you are now, right? So that makes sense. And I'll put a lot of people listening to this probably know Richard's name, and I'll put links to, as Bob mentioned,
Sure.
The Mitchell Report and McLaren Report. I'll put that in the show notes as well. People are familiar with that. One of the bigger names in some of the bigger anti-doping stories that are out there. So just out of my own curiosity, I mean, as you said, integrity in sport, there's a lot that goes into that. I mean, maybe give our listeners like a couple examples. What are a couple of the current projects that you're working on now with McLaren?
No, sure. Happy to do that. Well, we're on retainer with a number of companies. Ultimate Fighting Championship is one, Ironman Triathlon is another. And what we do with those sports is we administer their arbitration programs related to anti-doping. So, and I use the UFC as an example of when we think about anti-doping programs in professional sports. There's a lot of people who feel that sports can do better and can do more. And UFC, I think, leapfrogged every professional organization when they launched their anti-doping program a few years ago. That's administered by the United States Anti-Doping Agency. I mean, this program is very close to the WADA standard, the World Anti-Doping Agency standard, in terms of what they do with education, testing of their athletes. But if an athlete does has an anti-doping rule violation and they want to go to arbitration, we manage that entire process. We have a roster of lawyers who are arbitrators, and we are kind of the middleman between USADA, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, and the athlete who might want to appeal that. So we do that work for UFC and Ironman. Another recent project that we did that was fairly high profile was an investigation into the International Weightlifting Federation. And this was really an investigation into allegations of corruption with their longtime executive with the association. And that was a global investigation of corruption, everything from allegations of money laundering to the IWF demanding cash payments to make positive doping tests go away. So, that's a specific area of expertise of Richard and other partners on the team. But, another recent one we did that was quite interesting that relates to, the subject matter of the podcast today is, we did an extensive review of supplement practices in Canada, across Canada, in high performance sport for an organization called Own the Podium, which is, they're a not-for-profit. They're created to ensure Canada gets more medal podium finishes. And what happened in Canada just recently, in the last year and a half, was an 11-time sprint champion canoeist named Vincent Lapointe, and that's female, Vincent Lapointe, tested positive for ligandrol and was adamant that she got that through a tainted supplement. But all the supplements she was taking were received from kind of government-run sports centers and were tested and had none of this tainted steroid in the supplement. So we looked at all of the relationships in Canada and how supplements are manufactured, how they're marketed. We had great conversations, by the way, with Major League Baseball and people with NSF certified for sport in the United States and developed a program for them. And in the end, this person appealed to the International Canoe Federation. And by the way, it's not just football players and hockey players and weightlifters who take steroids, by the way. I mean, it'll shock you, the sports. But in the end, this person was exonerated because they appealed to the International Canoe Federation and it proved that the substance that she had in her body could have come from bodily fluids exchanged with her boyfriend. Sounds far-fetched, but I've heard a lot. You've probably heard more, but she was exonerated and made a case, and the boyfriend at the time, supported it and explained how this was in his system. And I won't go on to explain anything more about the bodily fluids, but that's just an example of you have a major league issue that generates a work product out of that because you need to better understand these areas of risk that organizations have. So, we've done work with universities on, whether it's investigations around specific integrity issues. We've talked about several of them, or having to kind of do a full policy review after an incident at a university to make sure that they have the right, policies and processes in place. And then the last thing we did recently was we did a symposium in Toronto, and this relates to being so close to the United States with the single sports betting, booming right now in the United States. We still don't have that in Canada. And there's a lot of issues with sports betting and match manipulation. So we ran a global symposium in Toronto on that issue. They're consulting on that in Canada, have written white papers. So essentially anything to do with integrity is our company's business, ranging from, like we've talked about, the theme is education. If we can educate people and educate administrators about how they can strengthen their policies and processes, that's a win. So we're doing work in that area to, helping people once they've been in crisis and help them get better, to avoid this in the future. It's interesting work. It's really rewarding work, but it's tough. I mean, it's tough every day when you pick up the phone, and you kind of have to be an evangelist for what you're suggesting, because you gotta convince people and persuade people that this is actually good to get ahead of it.
Yeah, and I think what's so cool to me about your story and what you're doing now is like, and we can go back to the beginning of this podcast and we can talk about what happened at Waterloo. And I mean, you even admitted like you didn't know anything about this stuff. Like you weren't educated much on steroids. This situation kind of was shock and awe at the moment. And then you go from that to what you're doing now and all the work within that field, and you just kind of stayed in it and use those lessons that you learned in a positive light. That's what's so great to us. And that's why you and I and our foundation, we've just been partners for so long, ever since those Waterloo days, right? I mean, I don't even know if I mentioned, like, Bob's on our board of directors. I mean, you can go back. You were the recipient of one of our annual Taylor's Award that we give out at our annual gala, where we give it to people that make an impact in the world of appearance and performance enhancing substances. Like, our time together goes all the way back to that story we first talked about. And so it's amazing to see everything that you've done since then. And we know we appreciate that relationship and look forward to it continuing, and applaud all the great work that you're doing in this area.
Well, I mean, really the credit goes to you guys reaching out to me. It's a foundational relationship for me in my personal professional life. Actually, I can look up and see the award, and I've got the copy of the book about Taylor's story as well up on my shelf here. So I just try to pay it forward. You guys were there for me in a really difficult time, and hopefully, I can be there and try to pay it forward as we go along. Yeah,
even this podcast today, I think, makes a difference for those that tune in and just hear this and continue to learn from it. So yeah, we appreciate it. That's why I was excited to do this podcast too, is like, we've known each other for a while and I haven't been able to catch up with you lately. So for me, I'm selfishly, like, I enjoyed learning more about what all you're doing right now. And I know our listeners gained a lot from it as well. All right. One more thing before I let you go. If you've kind of tuned in any of our podcasts before, at the very end, like, we like to ask just a couple of curveball questions. That's kind of what we call them. Basically just our way to, like, let's get our mind a little bit off of all this heavy stuff we're talking about, and just get to know Bob just a little bit more. So I got a couple for you. First one's probably easy, but, we're on opposite sides of the border. Obviously, we talked a lot about Canada, your experience up there. And I love every time I'm up there. The few times I have, I've really enjoyed my time up there. What's one of the things that you guys have that maybe we aren't aware of? What's one of your favorite parts about living in the Great White North, as you called it? Your words, not mine.
We have 4 seasons. You don't have 4 seasons in every state in the United States. And as much as that might be a curse to some people, it's pretty cool when the snow melts and you have this beautiful spring, and I'm looking out my window at beautiful fall colors. And you have 4 seasons in different places, but we have 4 seasons everywhere in Canada.
Look, I'm with you. So I'm the member of the team. I live in North Carolina. All those Texas guys to me are crazy. I don't know how they do. I'll call them in November and it's 72 and they think it's freezing outside. They're in a whole different ball game down there. I'm with you. I'll take 4 seasons any day. So that's a great answer in my book. All right, one more. So we spent some time in this podcast, like, going back in time and reliving, the situation at Waterloo and everything that went in there. We kind of focused on that. Let's take that idea of going back in time and just put it to the extreme. All right. So let's say you could go back in time at any point. This can be something in your life that you want to redo. This could be a whole different time period altogether that we aren't living in. Like, you get a time machine, you're going back. Where are you headed?
In my life, like regular time? Or can I go back to any time?
It's up to you. You can go back to any time. If you don't need any redos in your life, go back to wherever you want to.
No, I wouldn't change anything about my life or my decisions. But if I could go back in time, I don't know. I'd like to go back into a locker room in the NFL in the night, or the CFL even in the 1950s and 60s, because it would look completely different than it looks now. And even I spoke to some former professional athletes when we went through all the stuff at Waterloo and others, and they used to tell me that, they actually, in some places, would actually have pills in the locker stalls for the players, like uppers and things like that. And it's just, even when you think about like alcohol, and I used, as I mentioned, I grew up around this as a kid in professional sports. I mean, they used to bring just tubs of, beer on ice, and kind of that movie North Dallas 40. So I'd like to go back and it would be a real eye opener to see how far we've come from those days.
Oh man, I've heard so many stories, smoking cigarettes in the dugout between innings.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we've come a long way with that. We're talking about the different substances now that may be going on in locker rooms, but it's I'm with you. That would be quite a scene. So, all right. Well, Bob, look, I mean, this has been awesome for me. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. I know the listeners are going to love hearing your story and ways that they can take that and learn from it. And together, I hope what everyone's kind of taking away from this is how crucial education is. That's always been our mission. I know that's your mission with a lot of the things that you do now and what you did back in Waterloo. And so we applaud all your forward thinking and all the work that you continue to do to get the good word and the message and the education out there. So thanks so much for spending time with us, and thanks for all the support. And I look forward to our paths crossing again very soon.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.